Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a great show lined up for you tonight. We're going to kick it off by talking about Entra web sign-in. And I'm going to be honest with you, I actually didn't know exactly what this was because I've been a little bit of a step back from some of the device configuration things since I switched over from a cloud endpoint technical specialist to security. But this is some really cool stuff. So first of all, this is used and has been used in the past with Windows 10 and temporary access pass, or otherwise known as TAP. And so it came out there, and now it is generally available where you can actually use passwordless authentication for the Authenticator app or a SAML federated identity or Windows Hello for Business to sign over the web. And let me explain what that actually means. So when you turn on your computer and you get the sign-in window to your OS, to Windows operating system, you get certain options underneath depending on what you've configured. Baseline is you just get the password. If you have Windows Hello for Business, you might have a little keypad icon. You might have a little fingerprint icon. If you're using FIDO2 to sign in, you might have a little FIDO key to put in. But what this is if you've configured it, is a little web icon. So it looks like a little globe that you would associate with the internet. And when you click on that, if you have it enabled, it pops up a user interface that will take you to the web. And so the device does have to be connected to the internet, and it actually authenticates you over the internet into Windows. It is not a local authentication like your password would be, where it's cached, or the Windows Hello for Business PIN or fingerprint, where it's part of the TPM. This is authentication over the internet, and that will then authenticate you into the operating system. When it came out with temporary access password, or TAP, it was really useful. So for example, if you're an IT shop and you're trying to send a device to a user and you want them to be able to sign in, one of the biggest problems is most IT shops out there, they know the user's name and password, and then they type it in to cache the password in the computer. Therefore, they have a starter password. There's a methodology that all the IT folks know what the starter passwords are. And when you do that, that can be insecure. Someone leaves, they know the methodology. If they know there's a new user, they know that this is going to be the default password, or it's made up this way. Maybe you do a completely randomized password, but then you're putting it on a sticky note or something like that. And that is the user's authentication, like the actual username and password. With TAP, the idea was we give you a temporary password that is one-time use and can be expired over a certain period of time, even like as low as an hour, I believe. And then that can authenticate you over this web. And then once you're authenticated into the operating system, you're able to then set up all the things, reset your password, or set up Windows Hello for Business, PIN, fingerprints, so on and so forth. This extends that capability to the Authenticator app and any SAML federated identity. Very, very cool. You do have to be on Windows 11 version 22H2 or later in order to configure this, if you're using it for the Authenticator app and SAML federated identity. With TAP, you can be on Windows 10. If you're trying to deploy it, you do this through Intune. Now, one of the caveats is this does have to be an Entra joined device, formerly known as Azure AD join. So it does have to be a cloud device. It cannot be a hybrid device. And you would deploy the configuration through Intune under the settings catalog under authentication, and you're just enabling web sign-in. There's three options. You can enable it and just have the icon show up. You can enable it by default, which then shifts the icon over to the left, being the first option, or you can disable it completely. So very cool feature for passwordless authentication for Entra joined devices.
When Andy told me about this in the pre-show, it was something I knew existed for the TAP capability, the temporary access pass. I did not know it had been extended. Now, it's one of those things that when you hear about and you may not understand all of the engineering effort behind it, you say, well, how hard could it be to implement something like that? Well, I think this was actually fairly challenging to implement, but now that it's here, it's one of those things that makes a lot of sense in many scenarios and really adds a lot of additional capability. And it allows you to do that without hooking into like the authentication stack in the operating system itself, which I don't like when stuff does, because I think that creates attack surface in one of the most sensitive parts of the operating system. So one of the use cases Andy mentioned was if you have a federated identity provider, you're not using Entra ID beyond just kind of the basic capabilities. You have a different cloud IDP like Ping or Okta. You could actually use it with this, where maybe you want someone to get prompted on their Okta app as part of the sign-in process. You could now do that. That's pretty cool. So some additional useful capability. The other thing I'll point out again, this is only for Entra joined devices, not Entra hybrid joined devices. And the horse is dead, so I won't beat it any further. But if you need more and more data points that Entra join is the future, and you need to be taking active steps to get here, here is yet another data point you can add to the list. New features are shipping first and sometimes only for Entra joined devices. And as I always point out, it makes no sense in 2023 to build new Windows workstations that have a dependency on line of sight to a domain controller when they're not sitting inside a corporate network all day. So it is time to draw that line in the sand and to move forward there. And we have multiple previous episodes you can listen to. For more information on that, go check out the 2 episodes with Shane and Fritz for more. But really cool stuff, and adds a lot of additional capability for different use cases where you may need this.
The next cool feature that I wanted to talk about is a little bit more Microsoft centric. And as we always mention, Adam and I both work for Microsoft. This is device control with Defender for Endpoint. Now, this has been a big sticking point for me because I used to be a cloud endpoint technical specialist. I would get a lot of customers asking me, Andy, how do I block USB devices using Intune or Defender for Endpoint? And previously, it was a little bit more difficult. Now, blocking USB within Windows is not a new capability. There has been a GPO that has been out for a very long time that you can do that. And any GPO can be scoped as an OMA URI string within Intune. And so that capability has existed. It just has been a little bit tedious to administer because you have to, for Intune, enter in a new string every single time when you're adding in an exception, because as we know, in most cases in security, it's really not about just blocking it. It's about how do I make exceptions, because there ultimately will be exceptions to this policy. So it was tedious to administer. We had to use a different string every single time and then redo that configuration profile. That capability still exists today if you want to administer this blocking through Intune solely. So that's not changing. What's new is we can actually use Defender for Endpoint to enforce this setting. And now we have a brand new, very pretty user interface with little drop downs that can deliver the policy. So there's 2 ways to do it. The first one is through Intune under the attack surface reduction rules. And you just create a new rule within Intune under the security settings. And once you do that, you can use the Defender for Endpoint agent, so to speak, to enforce that. So as part of the prerequisites, the device does have to be enrolled in Intune. You do have to onboard it to MDE, and you have to have some updated malware clients that are associated with that. That's one way to do it. And again, it's great. It's part of the settings. You have different devices you can add. You can add the USB ID within there, and it's all very similar to any other security endpoint solution that might be out there that can block USBs. You can easily add exceptions to it. The other way to do it is solely through Defender for Endpoint. Because the settings sync from Intune under Endpoint Security to the security portal within Defender for Endpoint, you can actually just create a rule within there and enforce it solely through Defender for Endpoint. Now, there's a configuration called Defender for Endpoint Security Settings Configuration, or formerly known as MDE attach, which I still use that term, where you're just onboarding a device to Defender for Endpoint and it's not enrolled in Intune. And there were many customers who were asking for this. I just want to manage the security settings, and I don't need to manage like the start menu, the background for the Windows device. I just want to manage the security settings. Can I do that? And that's been out for a while. And you can do that and create an attack surface reduction rule just for this. And it's under something called reusable settings within Intune. And then you just add new USB devices. To be clear, this is for removable storage. So USB thumb drives and hard drives. There are other settings which MDE and Intune are capable of, which is more in line with the installation of USB devices, because there have been attacks in the past where I emulate the installation of like a USB headset or a USB mouse, and then the drivers get installed. And then as part of that, you can then open up different attack surfaces based on that. And so there are ways, like if your company only uses Logitech keyboards and mice, then you can block the installation of other ones. That's not this. There is another setting that is for that. Today, we're really just talking about removable storage, which is a lot of what most companies do when they talk about blocking USB. It's really just storage because you don't want to exfiltrate data. You want to control that. So really cool feature. It's been asked for a long time. I'm super happy that it's finally in preview. This is not a generally available feature. It is in preview today, but very, very welcomed.
Absolutely something customers have asked about for a long time. And part of the reason why is because other endpoint protection platforms do this as part of their solution. Sometimes at Microsoft, we have philosophical differences in how we think you should approach something. We think, as opposed to doing it this way, have you considered doing it that way? And up till this point, our position has been that this sort of control is actually not really the responsibility of the endpoint protection platform. It should be part of the endpoint management, the device management process. And that's why this has all been available and it's all lived in Intune to this point. And honestly, could have had some UI improvement as well. What's really nice about this is, as Microsoft has developed the feature set to have some device security management as part of the endpoint protection platform, this came along for the ride and got added to it as well. And the one thing I particularly like about this is, Andy, you mentioned there's a synchronization between both the Defender for Endpoint console as well as Intune. So regardless of where you configure it, if you use both control planes, endpoint management and endpoint security, you get that visibility across both. So I think maybe worth the wait in terms of this is a really well done solution now and delivers something customers have asked for a very, very long time. So if you are a Defender for Endpoint customer and you've been looking for a way to streamline your process of blocking or limiting USB removable storage devices, now you have that a much better UI to accomplish that moving forward. And like Andy said, blocking's one thing, but it's really managing your exceptions that's the more important part as well. And that should also be more streamlined moving forward. So all in all, a win, still in public preview. So be sure to check it out and send your feedback along.
I wanted to add a few more points on this as well. Number one, Adam, you said if you're a Defender for Endpoint customer, and most customers actually are Defender for Endpoint customers, because if you're ME3, part of the E3 suite, you get Defender for Endpoint P1, and that allows you to use this feature set. Attack surface reduction is part of the Defender for Endpoint P1. Mm-hmm. Now you might ask, Andy, what if I don't use Defender for Endpoint? I am a CrowdStrike customer, or I'm a Sophos customer, or I use Sentinel-1. That's okay. You can actually use Defender for Endpoint in passive mode. I do have to check whether or not you have to be in active mode to actually enforce this, because sometimes there are ways to do that. But the point stands that you can use Defender for Endpoint. You can onboard it to Defender for Endpoint and still have an active EDR solution on top of that. So it's called passive mode. There's documentation for it. And I believe this probably still will work because it just needs to be onboarded. But more to come. If that is your use case and you're thinking about using it, I would definitely check with your Microsoft representative and see if that is a viable solution for you. So just two things that I wanted to add real quick. The final topic that I wanted to talk about today is something that I think we all deal with within IT, within information security. I do a lot of mentoring as someone who's been in the industry for a little while now. Part of the mentoring that I do is with the Microsoft Software and Systems Academy, which is a program that's sponsored by Microsoft that will give training to veterans and transitioning military members to prepare them for a career in IT or information security. And so we were talking about some things this week in professional development. And one of the questions that my mentees asked me was, when do you feel confident enough to put a skill set on a resume? Say, for example, PowerShell or Python or something like that. When do you feel confident enough that you're able to say, yes, I am proficient in that skill set? Or maybe when you might be considered an expert. I really hate using that term because it's very hard to say when you are an expert, but we all deal with this. And, the term is really imposter syndrome. And I think it's something important because we never really are like confident enough to say I'm the expert, and we're always learning. But I think the reason, the timing when you can start putting things on your resume and starting to consider yourself very proficient is when someone starts coming to you and asking you questions, and you're able to answer them without having to look it up. And maybe you're able to teach someone a little bit about that skill set. So maybe Adam will come to me and ask me about PowerShell, and I can teach him, okay, well, this is how you would write this particular script. And so I just wanted to talk about, because it is something that I think everybody deals with. And so if you're feeling like that, it's not rare. You're not alone. And even if you've been in the industry as long as Adam and I have, we still learn things every day. I just talked about it in the beginning, where web sign-in had been around for a while, and I actually didn't realize how it worked until I watched a video on it. And so, just wanted to mention a little bit about imposter syndrome.
There's a concept that as your knowledge increases, your confidence decreases. So as you know more about something, you learn all of the things you don't know, and you become less confident in giving definitive answers. So you actually see, as someone gains more expertise, their answers become more nuanced. They say well, maybe, or it might be this. They give less absolutes in their responses. And so that can be confused for imposter syndrome as well. And that really speaks to your maturity in a space. I was going to say, if someone is thinking about it enough to ask the question, when can you be confident to put a skill set on your resume? They're already in the right direction, because there's already some probably incompetent person out there who has no problem putting it on their resume. So if you're thinking about it and you give it that critical thought, you probably can make a good decision on that. You probably have a good sense of that. I like your metric for that, Andy, which is, are you being asked by other people? Can you teach someone about it? Those are really good questions to ask. But again, I think if you've already taken that step back and you have that ability to say, gosh, I'm not confident if I can put this down, then your thinking is already in the right place. So I love that people are thinking about that, because having that humility, I think, in all fields should be applied to this field. And it's been one of the things that detracted me from it going into cybersecurity originally was, and I think this has changed, to be fair, but 6 or 7 years ago, I felt like most cybersecurity practitioners were know-it-alls. And I feel like today I work with a lot more people, and the customers I work with, who are very humble and admit freely, we don't know it all. We don't have it all figured out. We don't have all the answers. We want to learn more. And they bring that learn it all mindset with them to their work. So imposter syndrome, absolutely something we all deal with. I deal with it every single day. I have to pinch myself and say, do I really get to do what I do every day? And why would anybody trust me? Why do I know anything more than anyone else? And it's great. Again, just having that humility and humble mindset, I think, will serve you well in your career if you can take that step back. So the more you know, the more you don't know, right? So anyhow, great stuff here. I love that you're doing that mentoring, Andy, for folks. I mean, I felt like we never had a formal relationship with it, but when you first came to Microsoft, kind of did some of that informally for you. And I love that cycle of giving back now as well. Because now that you've been at Microsoft for a long time, you have a lot of experience to share, what works, what doesn't. And that's the other great thing about this is, I think over time, your imposter syndrome may fade somewhat, but keep in mind how you felt and make sure you share that with the next generation of folks who come into whatever your area of cybersecurity is, and always be willing to share and give back in whatever way you can. And that's one of the ways we can also lift this industry and move it forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we did have an episode on mentorship with Matt Wood, who was one of my former mentors. And like you said, Adam, sometimes mentor-mentee relationships are not formal.
Mm-hmm.
They're not like, hey, you're my mentor, and like we're going to sit down every day at this time or every week at this time and go through stuff. Sometimes it's more informal.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone asks you a question, instead of giving them just a straight up answer and then sending them on their way, maybe you can prod them and see if there's anything else that they want to know about, or just go into some of your experience, and maybe they don't know which questions to ask because they're so new. And so you can give them some insight on that. And so definitely continue that cycle, because as you get more experience, whether you know it or not, you will probably become a mentor to someone, and you should embrace that opportunity, because everyone can benefit from that. Like you said, Adam, it kind of raises that level for everyone. And the other thing too, I just wanted to say is, when you get the opportunity to ask someone a question, what's most important is to at least do some of the work yourself. I think when I first started in this industry, I would just straight up ask someone the question. And now I do a lot of research myself, because, in all honesty, when someone asks me a question, I would say about 50-50 of the time, 50% of the time, I actually just bring up a web page and look up the answer because I might not know the answer, right? And so I just bring it up and search it myself, and then I tell them the answer. So if it's something that is easily searchable, then, make sure that you're actually doing this research. If you're asking the question, you can say, hey, I'm curious about this configuration or this particular topic. I've looked it up. I have gone to these resources and I can't find the answer. I think it's this. Can you confirm or let me know what you think, right? And so that really sets up the person who is that you're asking for help to have a little bit more context of what you've already done versus, if you're just asking a question straight up.
Yeah, great call out. And I'd mention the other thing is part of gaining knowledge and experience over time isn't knowing all the answers, it's knowing where to look. And that's a huge part of it too. I'd say my superpower is being able to search the Microsoft Docs site because I have read almost every bit of documentation at some point or another, or at least scanned it. And I know there's a page that talks about this. I need to go find it. Like, for example, I know there's a page about Entra ID that compares the 3 authentication methods: pass-through authentication, password hash synchronization, federated authentication. And there's a table and explains all the differences. I don't have it even bookmarked probably, and it would be hard to find, but I know it exists. I know where to find it. And it's things like that where I have a lot of that, up here. But if I want to share with others, it's best to just know where to go. And so, I wouldn't even dismiss yourself, Andy, of saying, hey, sometimes when I got asked a question, I just look it up. That's still a skill, is knowing where to look and what a reputable source is. And you've probably seen maybe the bit of doc you're looking for before. So you know what you're looking for. You just got to find it again.
Absolutely. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, please reach out to us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.